In this video, we're going to UV unwrap the suitcase model that we created in the last video. Now, before you start UV unwrapping, you should think about how you're going to texture the item, because that can inform how we UV unwrap our model. I'm going to texture this item in Substance Painter, so that's also going to inform the way we UV unwrap it. The model that I've created does not have a normal map. I'm not creating a high poly and baking a normal map. So because I'm not doing that, that also affects the way we UV unwrap it, and that's also affected how we modeled this item. So to begin UV unwrapping, we're going to do it in sections. So I'm going to first work on the base of the suitcase, and then I'll go through and do the different elements. So I'll select the base, and then in my modeling menu up here at the top, we can go to UV editor, or on the shelf there's a button for it right here. Now in this version of Maya, it's really easy to accidentally dock this stuff in other places, so just be mindful of that. When you first open it up, your UV toolkit part might be floating. I like to keep them together. The UV editor in this version of Maya got a makeover, so it's changed a lot from the previous versions. This UV toolkit is a new thing, so there used to be buttons up here and down here, and so now they exist in this right menu inside of these different collapsible menus. You can also find things in the menu up here, the same marquee menus, so if we hold down right click, shift right click, those same menus still exist. So what I'm going to be doing is I'll right click to go to the different components, and then I'll grab them, and then if I do shift right click, I can get access to the different tools that have to do with that component. So sometimes I might do that, sometimes I might get them from over here on the right. So usually to begin a UV unwrapping, when we first have our model, we see our UVs over here in the 0 to 1 space, 0 to 1, 0 to 1. By default, it just shows us the UV shells like with a wireframe. And if we come over here to the top, we can turn on shaded UVs. I prefer to work like this because now I can actually tell where the shells are. You can turn it off by just going back to the wireframe mode. Over here on the right, we have this checkerboard icon, and so if you click on that, that will toggle on a checkerboard pattern, and sometimes we'll be turning that on so that way we can see how our UVs are going if they're being laid out properly. So when we first begin, the UVs that we are given are kind of useless. They're just sort of based off of the original object that it started at. So since it started off as a cube, it's just a really messed up cube's UVs. So what we need to do is reproject these UVs. The first thing I usually do when I'm UV unwrapping is to do an automatic map. So I'm going to select my object, create automatic. Now we may end up reprojecting them differently, but by doing an automatic map, what that does is it automatically projects it using like a box. So it does front, top, sides, and lays out the UVs in that way. And that's kind of nice because what we get here is a lot easier to see than what those original UVs were. We may end up going back here and projecting in a different method, but by starting out with automatic, we get something that we can actually understand. Now when you do the automatic, it brings you this gizmo here. You don't really need to mess with this at all. You can just hit Q to finish the operation. So now we have to think about how we're going to texture this item. The texture that I'm going to go for will have these edges as a different material. When we're UV unwrapping, it'll be easier if we make this a separate shell, these parts separate shells, so that way we can color them differently a lot easier. What I want to do then is grab these faces that are going to be a different UV shell, so that way I can cut them from the existing UV shell. Because right now this is all one UV shell. So I'll right click, go to face mode, and that way I can easily grab these center faces. Now, there's two ways we can do this. You can go over here to cut and sew, and then click cut, and then that will cut them along the edges. Or if you're using an older version, you would need to be in edge mode. So you could go to Control, right click to edge, and then that would convert your selection to the edges. And then you can use Shift, right click, cut. I may end up doing both methods when you see me cut, just because I'm used to the second method. We can see these white bold lines. Those are the seams of our UV shell. So that's where it is not connected. So if I right click and go to UV shell mode, Now I can grab the whole UV island, and so those faces are no longer attached as just one big UV shell. So what I'll do is let me just grab those faces again. I'm in UV shell mode, but the face is its own UV shell, so it's okay. And then I'll just move them off to the side. We have all this workspace here, so don't be afraid to just move your stuff out. So now that I have these guys out, they're pretty much good to go. So now I can start thinking about this area. Now, when I texture this, I don't really want there to be a seam right in the middle of this area, because then when we look at up close at our model, we'll see that there's this break in our texture. So I want it to be seamless from here to here. To make things a little bit easier so I can see my model better, I'm going to select it, and then in my viewport menu, click on Isolate Selected, so that way I can just see it by itself. I'm going to make some cuts and sew some things together so that way I can create the shells that I want. So if we're looking at these two and I want to make them the same UV shell, right now if I were to grab this middle edge, if we looked where that was, that would connect this entire shell and this entire shell together. So what I need to do is really just cut these guys apart. Now when we're doing cutting and sewing, we can select components in the UV editor, or we can select components in the 3D viewport. So just pick whichever is easier. Right now I think I'll have an easier time if I just grab the faces here, or the edges, and then to do UV operations to them, you have to do your shift right click in the UV editor window. So now that I have those two edges selected, if I do shift right click, I can cut them, or I can click on that cut button right here. So I'll select the next edges and cut those, shift right click cut, and then now I can sew these together. So shift right click, and then I use move and sew, which will move the edges together and sew them. The sew button is also over here. You can click on that. That will sew them together, but it's not going to move them. For me, I prefer the shift right click method because eventually it becomes kind of like muscle memory, so you can just simply shift right click, move up, and you know that it happened. Okay, so now that I have this UV shell, I'll just grab it and move it off to the side so we can see it. So I want these two faces to be a UV shell. They're already sewn together, so I'll just go ahead and cut them so that way they're not attached here. I can move my way down. I'll make a cut here. Then I'll go over to the other side and do the same thing. So I want to make a cut here. Cut it there. Let me go to UV mode, UV shell. So now these two faces here in the middle, they're their own UV shell. That's what I want. And then I want to bring these two faces together. So back in edge mode, I'll select the edge, move and sew. Now I have a UV shell here and a UV shell here. I would like for these faces to just be one shell. So I'll go in and I'll cut them where they need to be cut. Right here too. Now your gizmo might be getting in the way, so remember a Q will just go to your select tool, so that way there's no gizmo. Okay, and so now I know, thanks to this white bolded line, that this is all a UV border edge here. So now I can grab where I want to sew them and sew them together. So now I have a UV shell for just this section. So first I'm going to do all these corner pieces. This object is symmetrical, so we could also go in and maybe just do half of it and then mirror over the other half if we really wanted to. Now that I have all the corners, I'm going to grab their UV shells and just move them over so that way I can have them all together. So next I'll go in and I'll work on the side faces. In Maya, you can cut and sew multiple edges at a time. Alright, so I think with that we now have all of these faces here as a separate shell, and then these corner faces as a separate shell. So the next thing I want to do is just kind of organize these together. Also, the other thing I want to do is have them all be oriented the same way. That way when we're taking this over to Substance Painter, we know like this is the left side, this is the right side, and we know that they're all consistent. To turn on the snap rotation, go to your rotate tool, shortcut E, and then you can Control Shift right click and then turn on snapping. Now that I have these guys sectioned out, I just want to make sure that they are like facing the right way. So if I right click, go to UV mode, I could select this row of UVs, and then I know that they're all on the left side. So I'll just make sure I don't have any mismatching. So like right here, one of these shells is rotated the other way. It's not a super big deal, but sometimes it's nice, especially if you're planning to texture it in a certain way. That can, when you get into your texture program, you might be trying to pull off some effect and you think that they're all oriented the same way. So it's nice to just already set that up. The next thing I want to do is adjust these to also make sure that they're oriented the way that I think they are. Now, this is kind of like a personal preference thing, but you want to organize this stuff in a way that makes sense to you when you're texturing. So if you're planning to put some sort of like graphics or something on the suitcase, and it makes more sense for you to texture it like this, where it's laid out at this orientation, then you should adjust your UVs to portray that. If it doesn't matter to you and you're fine with just texturing them oriented like this, then you can leave them alone. But just remember to always be thinking about how you're texturing an item and laying it out in a way that will help your texturing. So for me, I'm going to go and isolate this. I think I would prefer if my suitcase was oriented like this, where it was sideways. I knew that the top was where the handle was, and then the bottom was where the bottom of the suitcase was. I think that would help me texturing. To figure out where that's at, you can grab the UVs, and so I can see that that's right there. So that means I need to just rotate this face over. So I'm going to take all of these and just rotate them all together, because I'm thinking that they should be lined up then. So then this one, it looks like they're kind of mismatched. So this back face, I'm just doing the same thing, so that way I know the top of it is at the top. Now we could do the same thing to these other faces if we wanted to. We can kind of tell because of the way the cut is right here that that's the top part. So those are good to go. But just keep it in mind, lay out your UVs in a way that will help you. Next, I'm just going to group these guys together roughly. Later on, once we have our other items done, then we'll come in and actually lay these out for real. Because in the end, all of our UVs are going to end up existing in this 0 to 1 space. But while we're working, after I finish UV unwrapping a section, I'm just going to grab those UVs and just kind of put them off to the side in one of these other quadrants, so that way at the end I'll have all these different UV shells sectioned out, and then I could come in and add them into my 0 to 1 space. If we were done and we wanted to put this stuff in the 0 to 1 space, we could go and do that by hand by just moving them over. Down here at the bottom, there's an arrange and layout section. And so if you were to select your faces or your UV shells and you hit layout, it'll automatically try to smush them into that 0 to 1 space. It kind of ignores any orientation stuff you do. It's just sort of an automatic thing. So it's maybe not going to give you the layout that you want. So I still prefer to move them myself, so that way they preserve that rotation, and that way I can put them where they want to go. But that can sometimes be a quick way to just call everything back to the middle. Okay, so now I'm finished UV unwrapping this base, so I'll right click, go back to object mode, and then I'll start working on another piece. Next, I'm going to UV unwrap the corner. I'm actually just going to UV unwrap one of these, and then I'll go in and I'll copy it over to these other ones. So what I'm going to do is separate them out. So to do that, I'll just select the object, shift right click, separate, and then that will separate them into separate objects. We saw how over here we have the create menu that has all of our different projection methods. There's also a create menu here with the same projection methods. And now you can click on them to do the same stuff. In order to get the options, you have to shift click, and then that will open up the options for you. I think I'm probably still going to default to using this menu. The projection method we're going to use is not automatic. We could do that just to start off and see what we get. That's kind of easier to see. It just breaks it up into these 3 chunks. The method that I'll use is the planar method. So I'll go to create, planar with options, and this will project it in one axis. Or it'll do it based off of this best plane. So basically the kind of UV shell I want is one that's just sort of the whole thing. It's basically like it's just taking a picture of it from right here and projecting a UV. So to get that, if we have our default settings on, you just have to come up here and say fit projection to best plane. And now it'll ignore the axis. And so now if we hit project, so I'll hit Q to just finish that. The shell that it gives me is an OK start. I'm going to click on my checkerboard so we can see what it looks like, how it's really laid out. So if I go over here in my 3D viewport and start checking it out, you'll see that these areas are kind of messed up. We have some faces that are sort of overlapping each other. We have a lot of stretching here. So sometimes when we project things, we have to go in and unfold them so that way they're laid out fairly. Now, I didn't really need to mess with this too much with the base of the suitcase, but if we take a look at that with our checker pattern on, you can see that the squares are all even and all the same size. That's what we want. We want to try to get as close to that as we can. Sometimes it's kind of impossible because this is a 3D object and we're trying to lay it down in a 2-dimensional way, and that's not always possible, but we can try to get it as close as we can. To unfold it, if we come over here, there's a whole menu with unfold options. Now unfolding usually happens at the UV level, so if you go to your UV mode and you select the UVs and shift right click, you also have unfold tools in here. So if I were to grab this UV shell, one of the first ones you can go towards is optimize, so we'll click on optimize, and that just very quickly lays it out in a different way and just kind of unfolds it, relaxes it, and stretches it out. And so we can see what that did. There's still a little bit of skewing around these areas, but it can't really be helped. But it's a lot better than what it was. So optimize can be a good first one to go with. Unfold is another method. Oops, I got to have the UV shell selected. Basically, a lot of these different unfolding tools, they do the same thing where they're trying to unfold your object, but they just do it using different methods, different, calculations. There's also this optimize tool where you can come in and kind of like paint, and you can see it's slightly moving the UVs around. I'll hit Q to exit that. So there are these different methods for you to try out. So these UVs are down here at the bottom. So for me, I'm just going to go ahead and rotate them so that way that's at the top. Just so that way it can maybe be a little bit easier for me to remember the top of this is the one that's closer to the top of the suitcase. Alright, now that we've UV unwrapped this one, I want the same exact UVs for all the rest of these guys. Sometimes what we can do is UV unwrap something first and then mirror it over. We could definitely just re-mirror this. But there is a way we could go and copy the UVs of something over to an identical object. Because if we had 100 of these pieces, we may not want to go through the trouble of remirroring them or replacing them. So this method will work as long as our pieces are identical. They have the same number of vertices. So to do this method, you want to select your object, select the object you're trying to transfer over to. To do this, we're going to go to Mesh, Transfer Attributes with Options. I'll reset it. So basically down here where it says Sample Space, this is the one that we want to affect. We're going to switch this to Component and hit Apply. And so sometimes some of these, like Component, it looks like it did it, but if I take a closer look at the object I was trying to affect and I put on my checker map, you can see kind of put the faces where they were supposed to go, but not really. So that's not really what we want. So just realize that some of these methods, it'll look like they did what we want, but they didn't really. So let's try out a different method. So I'll just go ahead and undo. I'll select the original one where I'm trying to move them over to, and then the next one we'll look at is topology, apply. And so this one should give us the result that we want, where you can see it matched it up to the UVs, but also we can see our object actually really did match up correctly. That's transfer attributes with options, topology, that should transfer over our UVs. So what we can do, we'll just select one, select the other one, apply. If we have our checker map, we can kind of tell pretty easily that it worked. And I'll just go down the line. You can see they're turning pink, and that's just because they have history. Once we're all done, we'll go ahead and delete the history. Okay, there we go. So now we can grab these pieces. I'll exit out of here, delete my history. To have a little easier control over all the objects, I'm going to go ahead and combine them all for right now. So shift right click, combine. I'll delete my history, so that way I can just access all the UVs at the same time. So sometimes we may want an object like this where the texture is going to be identical, so to save space we just have the UVs stacked on top of each other. That's pretty common. Sometimes if we're doing a more realistic sort of texturing method, if we're doing normal maps, sometimes we can't do this method. Sometimes it can still be helpful to save on texture space. For us, we're actually going to go through and we're going to separate all of these out so that way they're not stacked on top of each other. If I take a look at the suitcase base and the corner pieces, they are getting a different amount of resolution on the texture. So this corner piece is huge compared to the whole suitcase. And in the end, I want to make sure that these are the same size. You want to make sure that your objects have the same texel density. So that means they're getting the same amount of resolution on the texture. Sometimes we can kind of bend this rule a little bit, but it's a good idea to keep things relatively the same. Places where we could bend the rule is maybe if we had a character, maybe the bottoms of their shoes aren't as important, so they could still be shrunken down to be a little bit tinier. So to adjust this, I'm just going to grab my UV shell and then scale it down to match up with the size better. There we go. So next, I'll go through and I'll grab the UV shells and just move them over. Last, I'll just take all of these and move them off to the side. Next, I'll do the handle. I'm going to begin by doing an automatic map just to see what I get. Okay, so I want this part to be its own UV shell, so I'm just going to go through and I can see where my border edges are, so I'll double click to grab that edge loop. Shift right click, move and sew. I'll grab this one, move and sew. Now you can see I've got some issues here, overlapping faces. This shell looks pretty bad, so I'll just go over to my UV shell mode, optimize to just help unfold it. Looks like I still have some overlapping faces, so let's try it again. You can actually do it multiple times and it does multiple iterations. There's also this optimize tool, which will I could use that maybe. That's looking better. Let's take a look at it with the checker pattern. Not bad. This piece, I could include it and have it be welded to there, or I could just leave it on its own. That means that there's going to be seams right here, but it is the inside of the handle, so maybe we're not really going to get to see that, and it's just a minor thing. It's just a compromise that we'll make. When it comes to UV unwrapping, a lot of the times we're compromising between skewing of our resolution, we're compromising where we put our seams. We have to think about all that stuff. Now for this piece, I'll just go in and sew all the sides to it. We could leave our UV shell like this. And so you'll see the difference between the two is this corner has some stretching there because it's all sewn together, whereas this corner doesn't really have as much stretching, but it does have this seam here. So it depends if we're okay with that or not. Now I'll go through and I'll just resize this so that way they're the same resolution. And then I'll move these off to the side. For the hinge, I'm going to go through and basically create a planar projection for all three of these sections. So I'll double click, grab the faces for this, create, planar. Now I could actually choose the z-axis because that's what's running through it, and that will get me also what I want. Or we could keep it on best plane, and that'll get me something similar. So here, it'll give you kind of like the same result. Now when I do that, it's going to smush it to fit inside of this 0 to 1 space, so we'll have to go in and optimize it. Might rotate it a little bit, but that's okay. I'll do Control-Shift right-click to turn off my snap, just so that way I can straighten it out the way I want. Okay, that looks good. Now I'll do the next one. Grab the faces. I'll planar map it. Hit Q to exit. Optimize it. Move it over. The next one. Planar map it. Optimize it. Adjust it. Now I have this other lock over here on this side that I'm not UV unwrapping, but this is just one object, so there's only one copy of it. Delete the faces of the one that I didn't UV, and then I'll just mirror it over. So Shift right click, mirror. We might have to play with our mirror options. This UV window will show up on top of any of these mini options, so just FYI in case you can't find them. And so here I think we'll do, yes, positive X, and that will create a copy the way that we want. Okay, now when it mirrors an object over, it creates that copy as a mirror image. So you'll see I have these red UV shells on top of the blue ones, which makes a purple looking UV shell. And so the red ones are just flipped. It doesn't mean that they're wrong, it just means that they're flipped. So if I turn on my checkerboard pattern, you can see that the wording here, it says U1, V1. Here, it's backwards. 1U, it's mirrored. So it just depends if that's going to be an issue. In this case, we're not going to have these stacked UV shells. We're going to have them separate. So if we don't want it mirrored, if we were going to have some sort of wording on here or something, then that's when you would want to take note whether or not you want something mirrored or not. So to mirror them, we can just grab the UV shells and do Shift right click and then flip it, and that will flip. You can flip it horizontally or vertically, the U or the V axis. Now we'll adjust the size and move them over. The last thing to UV unwrap is going to be these hinges in the back. So I'll go ahead and this back part, I can do another one of those planar maps. Then I'll optimize it. Now for the cylinder, I'll double click and let's try doing an automatic to this. And I'll just move it off to the side here. I'm going to go in and sew the edges of the cylinder, so that's all one UV shell. And then I have these guys on their own, which is fine. Now if we look at the hinge, it's horizontal, so I would like this to also be the same orientation. So I'll grab these UV shells and rotate them. Then I'll grab this one, and I'll rotate it without snapping. Let's check it out with our checker pattern. Now I'm going to take this UV shell and I'll have that UV shell be over here on the left side, just so that way I can keep track of it. And then this UV shell, I'll have it be over here on the right side. Now we'll go in and resize these. and then move them off to the side. The hinge also has a mirrored version of itself, so I'll go ahead and just delete that and then remirror it over. Then I'll take these UVs and just separate them. I'll also go ahead and flip them by grabbing the UV shells, shift right click, flip. Now that we've completed the UV unwrapping, I can grab all the objects, and then I'll see inside of here that they're all spaced out in these different areas. And so now I'm going to go through and try to add them all to the 0 to 1 space. At this point, we could go in and combine our entire object, so that way when we select it, we get to see all the UV shells instead of having to have all of it selected. So I'll select all my objects, shift right click, combine, I'll delete my history. Now we'll go through and we'll start placing this. It's important to note that all of these are already resized, so if we're going to go and resize stuff, it's a good idea to just grab all of it and do it all together. When we're laying these out, we want to make sure we utilize as much of the texture space as possible. So I'm going to take this, I'll go ahead and grab everybody, and then I'll just start to scale it up so that way those UV shells here can take up as much of it as possible. Now we do want to leave some space between our UV shells, but I think we can go ahead and bring them a little bit closer. And that gives us a little more room to play with. Really, when it comes to texturing, you just want to get as much space as you can, because then that means we have more resolution on our texture. So at this point, I'm starting to run out of room, so what I could do is grab these UV shells. I can adjust the pivot. You can actually use your X grid snapping, and then you can use that to maybe scale them relative to a certain point on the pivot. So with what I have left, I still have a bit of room, so even if I were to take these last pieces and put them in that 0 to 1 space, I still have places in my texture where I have empty space. And so I do want to try to maximize this as much as I can. I want to make sure there's space between these. I want to make sure that they're staying inside the 0 to 1 space. So this is maybe where I could come in and give some pieces a little bit more resolution. So for instance, these smaller items like the locks and the handle, I don't want them to be too much different, right? Because then it'll be a little bit obvious. They'll have a lot more detail and a lot more resolution in the texture. But since we have that space available to us, we could come in and maybe adjust it so that way they can just have a little bit more resolution for their texture. Because if we think about this in terms of the texture, let's say this texture was going to be 1024 by 1024 pixels. So then one of these units is going to be about 100 pixels. So that means that these metal parts right here are going to get less than 100 pixels in their texture. So if there's some sort of detail you're trying to pull off, then maybe you might want to adjust them so that way they can have more resolution in their texture. There are certain workflows where this method would be frowned upon, but for what we're doing, it's okay. And there we have our UV layout.